Thanks. Thank you for having me. Look, we're small enough that we can have a conversation. I do have a presentation, but you can also interrupt me if you want. It's really quite okay. I wrote this book, okay? It took a lot of years, and I hope to share a little bit with you. I can't share the whole thing with you now, but perhaps get you to motivate a little bit. And I really appreciate you taking the time. So let me just say what the book's aspirations were, and then give you some flavor for it. The big question is, why did the commercialization of the internet have such a large economic impact? That's a big question. It's the big question in this area. What the book does, it accomplishes three things. It puts everything into one place. I like to say there's nothing in this book that wasn't already known by somebody. It just had never been all together. Second, it focuses on innovation and commercialization. There's lots of very good writing on invention, a lot less on commercialization. And then third, it offers a big picture, this phrase, innovation from the edges, which we can get to if we want. You might reasonably ask, who cares? And I think Jonathan gave the answer, because it changed everyday life. If you have children and you talk to them, I don't know if you've had this experience of showing them Leave It to Beaver on TV, and then you say, look, there's no internet there. And it really did change life. It's changed it as we know it. It changed business as we know it. It's changed an enormous number of industries, how they behave. It changed the identities of the leaders in many industries. It's the kind of thing that it was responsible for a boom in investment for about 5 years in the US. These are sort of things you don't see happening together very often in the 200-year history of capitalism, if I can make an overstatement. It's the sort of thing you only see with electricity, automobiles, the big things. Indoor plumbing, I put a list there, television, telephones. There aren't many examples like this, and so that in and of itself it's of interest, but I thought it's also of interest just to understand what happened and why we had a big impact. You can also see some of the symptoms and other things, like all the households that were online you had half the households online by the beginning of 2001, which is extraordinarily fast, and the number of businesses online, 90% of US businesses were online by 2001, which is also extraordinarily fast. So the other place to start is to start with misleading metaphors. The other reason to write this book, many people, when they look at the internet, want to look for an Edison or a Manhattan Project, look for something that the government did, as if the US government orchestrated this, or somebody invented the whole thing, and that's just wrong. That's actually a very misleading metaphor. There are some very, very smart people who were involved in inventing the internet, but if you want to understand why it had the economic impact it had, that's not the place to start. That's the other reason to write a book like this. So I'm going to focus on commercialization. This is the best picture I could find of tubes, by the way, that's in the slides. Commercialization in particular is taking technology and finding value in it. And that's where the focus of the book is. That's typically not something people write about, although you're all living it at the moment. The reason you want to focus on innovation and commercialization, it helps you, is a much better focus for understanding creative destruction and the kinds of processes we saw in the latter part of the 90s. And it's also a much better way to understand why some government policies succeeded and others failed. So the big question that shows up in the middle of the book is, how do major technologies deploy? And what are the processes that we observe, and what are the patterns we observe? And these are, by the way, these are very durable patterns, the kinds of commercial patterns you find over 100 years, the sort of things you see in electricity, major agricultural inventions, telephones, and so on. If you start from that question and you look at what happened in the middle of the 1990s, you actually look at computing in sort of its 2.0 phase. We're presently, by the way, in about a 3.0 phase of big data. Actually, you're at the center of the present phase. Let's say historically in about the mid-90s, we're at 2.0. 1.0 was pushing out the processors into the frontier and finding value in that. And the typical uses were just the first times anybody had ever done databases for airlines, hotel reservations, simple logistics, And 2.0, a lot of people knew that it was coming, was to do internetworking, that is to connect computers over large geographies and do a lot of automated processes. And a lot of prototypes have been built, so the value was identified in advance. What wasn't understood was what form it would take in commercial markets. That was where a lot of the mystery was. In this case, what happened is a very good identification of processes you find in lots of major technologies when they diffuse. And I'd call them the two conundrums in order to just identify for a general audience what a lot of research sees over and over again. So see, the two conundrums I call them the circular conundrum and the adaptation conundrum. So when major technologies diffuse, the big problem they face is you have to coordinate multiple suppliers all simultaneously around the same effort. And typically those suppliers are competing with one another, or they're not even talking to one another. And so getting them to coordinate can be very challenging. The second conundrum, adaptation conundrum, is when you have major technologies diffusing, typically they have to be adapted into a variety of circumstances in order to be valuable. And that's actually where most of the investment takes place. And nobody wants to make that investment unless they're sure the darn thing's going to pay off. And so then everybody holds back. So you typically get these two conundrums holding back major technologies from deploying. And the question that emerges if you look at any major technology is, how do you resolve these two problems? So I'll just do both of these in this case. And I actually think it helps people understand what we're going through today in a couple other major technologies. Okay, so that was the plan. So the circular conundrum is often called the chicken egg problem. If you've not heard this, that's a joke. Okay, so I'm trying. All right. So the theory is you have to coordinate multiple firms. So how do you do that? The classic chicken egg problem has the characteristic that multiple firms need to get their stuff to work together in order to create value, but all of them hold back, and so they all sit on the fence, and so you get long, long delays. Typically what you need is either a focal point, a mandate, a platform that coordinates, a standard that's voluntary that all can participate in. You need a mechanism like that to generate an overcoming the circular conundrum. I put a picture of Google Maps up here because in fact that is the function it serves. Just to give you an example, this is still something we see today. So what happened historically in '95? A metaphor that's often used is that what we got was a gold rush as the catalyst. That metaphor is a bit misleading, but it's actually, there's a grain of truth to it. And so I think walking through the story is actually really helps. Any of you ever been to the place for the 1848 gold rush? If you know anybody, okay. So just to give you a feel for what it is, that's a picture of Sutter's Mill. So if you, to give you an idea of what gold rush economics is about. Gold rush economics is actually an information problem. So what happened in the 1848 is a good illustration. If you look at the Sierra Mountains, they come up at an angle. They have the substrates underneath the surface, and then the glacier cut off a whole bunch of rock and exposed one seam of gold. Most of the seams of gold that sit in the Sierras are not covered by rivers, but they are covered by rivers in one place, which is the South Fork of the American River, which Sutter built his mill next on. And so what the river does is it took off a little bit of gold and put it in the water, but nobody had ever gotten up that high into the Sierras. Once Sutter put his mill that high into the Sierras, the gold dust, which doesn't travel very far, became found. And what that did is very quickly information about that discovery went out, and then we had a standard economic behavior, which is it was thought that getting to that gold quickly was going to get high returns. So you have the information goes out. Until then, nothing is known. Then the information spreads, and then there's a behavioral reason for everyone to rush in. That's a gold rush. So the question is, did we have a gold rush here? Was there something unknown that then became known and then generated a bunch of ideas that wasn't known, and then what were the behavioral reasons to rush in? That's the sort of question that you ask about this situation. So on the one hand, if I was being very pedantic, I'd tell you this wasn't a gold rush. There were plenty of firms who were investing prior to 1995. And so you couldn't argue necessarily there was something that was unknown. On the other hand, if you're being a little more charitable and you look at historically what happened, the coordinating mechanism is pretty obvious. It was Netscape's founding. And it wasn't Netscape's founding per se, it was the demonstration of a commercial browser as a commercial prototype. It was more than a prototype. It was actually for sale. And that was in February of 1995. And essentially what happened is many participants in industry, in the computing industry, at the same time saw the same commercial prototype within several months of one another. So you got the equivalent of a gold rush because they were all informed at roughly the same time, and then they all make their investment decisions at roughly the same time. That's actually what happens here. We could talk about Microsoft in a little bit if you want to. Microsoft has a slightly different history at this moment, and Google might take a lesson from that going forward. But we'll go to that in a little bit. The other thing that happened at the time, absolutely, the one thing about this history that's essentially very interesting is that the governance of the situation was unique relative to anything that had come before it. I think anybody in computer science now takes this for granted, but it was quite novel at the time. There was a governance structure both in the in the Internet Engineering Task Force and in the World Wide Web Consortium that had two characteristics that had not previously ever shown up in a major platform. The two characteristics were anybody could come and gain information about the technology, and second, there were no what a lawyer would call restrictive rights. There were no reach-through rights. The organizations giving out the information did not tell you what to do with it. So those two things, anyone could come in, and there was no constraint on what could be done with the information. The internet platform had no restraint on what was done with the information, and that was just a new characteristic. Any firm who had ever done a major platform until then had always restricted information flow in and out and use afterwards. And what that did is it generated what I think most people in computing take for granted, which is you get lots of specialists within platforms. So once you have a well-designed modular platform, you can get a specialist who takes for granted the rest of the platform and then does a commercial product that's off. In this era, this is the first time we ever saw major growth across the entire economy in a whole bunch of specialists taking advantage of the platform. I like to use this example from Hotmail since it was so simple. Hotmail is the first web-based email, and it had viral marketing. It had the little footer at the that said, "Get your new email at Hotmail," and the people who programmed this didn't have to do an enormous amount of work. They could take for granted the rest of the network was going to work. TCP/IP was going to work. The World Wide Web was going to work, and everybody else was going to be just fine. And if they got a wrong email address, it wasn't going to bring down the network. They could take for granted. They could do something very narrow and specialized and take for granted everything else. And this is a great example of what a modular platform with unrestricted information can do and did do in this case. So this was the other source of the gold rush. Okay, so that's the circular conundrum. Ready for the adaptation conundrum? Okay, the adaptation conundrum, I put up a picture here of, I don't know if anyone knows this one. It looks obscure, but it's fun. Any Midwesterners in the room? This is corn, okay? So particularly this is taken from hybrid corn. Okay, so I'll explain the association in a minute. So, again, here's the theory. The theory is when you get a new major technology deploying, it has to be adapted in multiple circumstances. That's something, again, we've seen multiple times anytime a major technology shows up. What happened here, same thing. You would expect the internet not to be used right away, but that it would need a lot of co-investment in a bunch of locations and in a bunch of businesses to turn it into something valuable. And then the open question is how does that co-invention organize itself? There's no natural there's no natural one answer to that question in any major technology. And what happened here, I sort of already gave you the answers. We got a bunch of innovative specialists. Unlike what we had seen historically in some major technology pushes where one firm had dominated the technology, say, for example, as in telephony, or in automobiles, the Ford Motor Company dominated it. Here we had enormous numbers of innovative specialists, each doing their own thing, and that ended up getting the investment in adaptation specialized across multiple players, and it was also done very quickly as a consequence. It meant all these people could act independently. Okay, so to give you an example, why do specialists do adaptation really well? This is one of my favorite stories from this era. Did anybody ever use this product? Any of you old enough to remember this product? Internet in a box. It's totally, it's cute. So what they did, this is a 1994 product. So what they did is they took basically a browser. It was a Mosaic browser. It wasn't even a Netscape browser. They put it on a disk. They stuck it in a box to make it look like, packaged software. And because that was the motif of the time, you would go to, do you remember Egghead or one of these retail outlets? And then you would buy packaged software. And then people went and bought it, and then they would put the internet in their PC. and it's sort of cute. And you go, really, come on. But this worked. This was extremely popular. And the point is that innovative specialists all find different little niche ways of adapting the technology to the sub-market that they perceive. So they perceived this sub-market for a bunch of new users that nobody else had perceived. They got a huge amount of attention, and so they were a hit. And they eventually ended up selling to someone else. The key to an example like this is the specialist is trying to learn something you don't otherwise see, you can't learn in a lab. They're quite typically trying to understand something about the mix between demand and costs that's not otherwise learnable through a simple experiment inside of a laboratory. Here's another example from the time, ISPs. Do you all remember dial-up ISPs? Why did the US get the internet earlier than any other country? This is the answer. Because we had they had the fastest deployment of the dial-up network anywhere in the developed world. And that arose, again, because specialists were these dial-up companies were specialists in all these different locations. And many of them had previously been bulletin board systems. And so you found them all over the place, and then becoming an internet service provider was a very easy thing for them to do. And so then this is my favorite quote of the book is, let's see if I can do this. A good predictor of not finding an ISP is the presence of a lot of hybrid corn seed, which comes from Zvi Grillikus, used to be a professor at Harvard who studied hybrid corn, and this is his 1957 dissertation, okay? One of the more famous studies of major technology deployment, and he observed that ISPs looked an awful lot like what he had studied years ago. You might ask a slightly deeper question, which is where did all these bulletin board systems come from? Where did all those specialists come from? It's one of the characteristics of the US. It's not unique to the United States to have large communities of what are known as wild ducks. Do you use that phrase inside Google as well? This is a perhaps archaic phrase now, but a phrase about computing about wild ducks, that people who look at things in a different way or have a different perception of what the innovative value is. The United States is not entirely unique in having communities of wild ducks, but had a fairly large community even at this time. And there were a bunch of regulations to protect them and mandate that telephone companies should work with them. And then there was also the First Amendment turned out to also support them, because many bulletin board systems were doing some unsavory activities. And we'll just leave it there. Okay, so, all right, so I'll finish up here pretty quick. One other place that's interesting to find adaptation is in business use. There were two things going on in business, often are really underappreciated. One was on the browser side, which looked a lot like home. The other was on enhancement of business services to support electronic commerce. That was really expensive, that kind of investment. As it turned out after the fact, we shouldn't be surprised by this, but many people at the time were surprised. After the fact, there was a large incentive by users to retrofit existing processes with something that saved the capital they already had. Users did not want to go into a greenfield situation typically. They typically want to preserve a lot of the things they already had. And as a consequence, many of the dot-coms who came into these businesses failed precisely because they didn't respect their end customer wanting to preserve what they were doing. And if you look in retrospect, the reason IBM succeeded in this era was precisely because they respected the existing processes of their client base. That's just one of the big lessons you have to walk away with from looking at this era. So, for what it's worth. And we could talk about the boom if you like. There was a boom. The boom had a gold rush. It was caused by the gold rush. There was a second thing going on, and that was a network effect where investment by firms in processes made browsing more valuable. That made more firms go online with electronic commerce, which then induced more browsing adoption and so on, and more investment in the network. And so you had these interplays which made it more valuable for each player to do more investment. That was the second thing going on, and that caused the boom in the 99-2000 era. And then, as an economy, we overshot, without question. So that's in a nutshell, chapters 9, 10, and 11 and 12, just explain how that overshooting happened. Okay, so I'm doing the whole thing quickly, just because it's more fun. Let me end with two things. Renewal. So after the overshooting, there were two forms of renewal that I talk about in the book. One of them is Wi-Fi. And where did Wi-Fi come from? Wi-Fi is a wonderful example because the spectrum was allocated. It was allocated initially for things that the engineers in the FCC regarded as garbage, and many engineers regarded as garbage. So baby monitors, mobile handsets. You remember these kinds of things inside your home, garage door openers, and the trick, the thing that happened was the unlicensed spectrum allowed equipment firms to embed the use of that spectrum inside of their wireless antennas and their wireless servers, and users found that very valuable. And so the spectrum ended up migrating from garage door openers. You still find it in some garage door openers, but it ended up migrating mostly into the area of Wi-Fi. And so the unlicensed spectrum ended up being this vehicle for movement of value from a low value use to a high value use. That's a pretty interesting piece of renewal. And then I had to do this example in this room just because it's well known. The book also has a chapter on internet advertising and Google's approach to renewing that market, which was on its way down at the time that Google starts to figure out how to do an ad auction-based an ad auction for keywords, which renews the market for advertising at the time. And I suspect this story is known in here, so I won't go over it. I had to bring it up because it's in the book. Want to do big lessons, or are we good? Big lessons, okay. Big lessons. That's my favorite big picture. Sorry, that's also a bad joke. Okay, what movie? Yeah, Ferris Bueller. Yeah. Okay, so the big picture, innovation from the edges is the major framing. That's about outsiders bringing new perception and new assets to bear on an opportunity that insiders were not investing in. The big lesson from this experience is the way outsiders explored, particularly outsiders who were specialists and innovative specialists, explored sub-pieces, and that unlocked the circular conundrum and the adaptation conundrum. That's the big insight of this experience. The book spends a lot of time filling in the gaps about why that happened and why. It has a lot of consequence for thinking about, say, for example, a company like this who supports a lot of innovative specialists as a major platform, and how would you think about taking activity to support and then start new platforms to support new innovative specialists. So in this instance, what we observed was this interplay between all the specialists who raised the value of each, the value of the investment by all of the others. And the other big lesson in comparison, why did you have this done in this way? Why did the network grow this way? And why didn't it grow from a telephone company? there were lots of opportunities for publicly supported telephone companies to grow a data network. And why didn't it happen that way? And the answer is that innovative specialists perceive things that otherwise would not rise to the top of priorities inside of a large firm. You get multiple points of view supported in this kind of market structure that you wouldn't otherwise get in a single firm. And that, as a consequence, you get more variety than you would otherwise get in a single firm. But if you were going to read this book with the present in mind, I would start by saying you would expect to see these two conundrums arising repeatedly. They still do. For example, if you look at big data 3.0, as I say, it looks to me like we're in 3.0 of big data. We've been in big data for a long time as an industry. But the present era of big data, you would expect to see circular conundrum issues showing up, which you do, and you see major firms trying to take positions as coordinators. I think you're in that business, so is Amazon, so is Microsoft. You see institutions that help coordinate large data as well. Again, we tend to have a lot of open systems doing that. You see government mandates, again, trying to take positions to unlock circular conundrums, particularly in the Healthcare Act. It's a present. There was actually lots of subsidies in the Healthcare Act to get hospitals all to do computing inside their organizations, so that then they would all use the same field so they could exchange data. That's a very standard way to overcome a circular conundrum. Then on adaptation, you would also expect to see that. Actually, you see that again. I mean, I could run through it again, but you see that in the present environment. My own forecast on, say, for example, the big data changes today is that adaptation is actually much easier than than we saw 20 years ago, partially because you don't really have to involve households very much. Most of the investment's being done in the infrastructure or behind the scenes, and it's being done by major businesses. And so largely those investments are done for private reasons and don't need to be coordinated very heavily with a lot of other firms. There's some standardization issues, of course, and some big government privacy issues that are difficult. But it's a challenging problem, but it's easier than the one we just observed in this book. So, thanks. Oh. I'm happy to have a conversation. It's small enough in here.
Could you give a specific example of the circular conundrum that you see today?
Oh, certainly on the smartphone market. I mean, yeah, though we're over that one at this point. In smartphones 10 years ago, we were still, think about it, before the iPhone, we were still facing the same old circular conundrum. Nokia and Microsoft had both done a lot of investments to try to overcome that. And then the iPhone ended up being the catalyst to start things, and Android was close enough behind, and with a governance structure that was very friendly to programmers and app developers, that it also managed to develop a network. That's what you have in mind?
Yeah, well, but how about one that hasn't been resolved yet?
Oh, that hasn't been resolved. Certainly Internet of Things has got that in it. Because of a bunch of the standards about security, for example, and how things should work with each other when they come across from different firms.
Do you see the emerging television standards now that everything is going on the internet essentially? There are already beginning to be interoperability issues between smart TVs and Roku and so forth. And in fact, I was just on the other side of the building, and people were talking about the impossibility of testing applications on things that have new models out every season.
Yeah, just in the streaming video side, even in the consumer side, it's there's still some serious issues. There's actually some public policy there also in getting the coordination between the. I almost hesitate to get into the weeds on this, on edge providers, if you will, and broadband providers, and what's appropriate behavior at handoff points and gateways between network providers. if you look, for example, at the issues that arose when Netflix was not working too well in January of 2014, to use a very simple example, that was from not having an understanding about how to coordinate data handoff between, at that point, either a backbone provider who was carrying a lot of data and passing it into a broadband network, or from a CDN into a broadband network. And there was a disagreement about the proper way to do that, or what both parties wanted to do. That's a pretty nasty circular conundrum if that one keeps arising, especially if everything goes online, as we're all forecasting. That's another one. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Well, and then are there any broad trends that you can use to predict how, say, like the Internet of Things?
Cars. What your firm's involved in is a pretty good one as well. We can all see that one coming. There's more than just. The cars already work, right? They already work. So the prototypes. We're in the situation now where the prototypes all work. We can all forecast there's going to be a scale decline in costs pretty soon. And there's an enormous amount of coordination that needs to take place between road building, insurance companies, legal standards for accidents and liability.
But in this case, it doesn't seem like firms are waiting to invest, right? There's already lots of companies investing in that.
Yes, there is already a lot of investment.
Is it that there isn't a clear direction, and that's sort of what's preventing it?
Yeah, so the danger at the moment in that area is we're going to get balkanized standards. So we'll get 2 or 3 different ways of doing things. In fact, it almost seems inevitable Europe will go one way and the US will go another. That just almost seems inevitable on this one. Even worse is California goes one way and the rest of the country goes another. That seems possible also. Particularly with cars, because California's always gone its own way on, say, for example, pollution controls.
So in this case, for cars, it sounds like the government regulations are what's going to ultimately determine, or is going to sort of solve.
It's going to be a major determinant.
Yeah. Is that always the case? Like for Internet of Things, is there another way it could go? Like, can you predict how that will be resolved?
No, it's hard to predict. I would, I never like to predict. I would be a little cautious in this example. 20 years ago, government regulation had 2 roles, and should be careful. Sometimes it's very interventionist because competition policy intervenes very directly when you have monopoly provision. That's still going to happen in this country. There's a long-standing dislike for monopoly provision in the United States. That's not going to go away. Monopoly provision is going to happen somewhere in transportation because there always are. It always does, and that's. You can forecast there will be government intervention very directly in the places where monopoly provision of transport services allows somebody to jack up prices or dictate terms, and government regulation will intervene. Okay, you just know that because there's a long history of that here. Having said that, one of the interesting things about watching the internet experience is government policy was not orchestrating. It was often stepping back. It was very deliberately stepping back and letting firms invest as discretion dictated, and you see a lot of that in the history here of particularly federal forbearance is the word the lawyers use. A deliberate stepping back from making decisions. So it would enable private industry to choose what it wanted to do without orchestrating the whole thing. And there was very selective intervention in things like establishing the Internet Engineering Task Force or in privatizing the backbone. But it was very selective. I wouldn't say it was always wise. I mean, the domain name system wasn't done particularly well, for example. So there's something equivalent's got to happen in cars. There's got to be a set of standards, for example, on how information is going to be interchanged between the various parties, particularly between people who watch roads and individual cars. All right, some of the things, I mean, you guys would actually know better, I suspect. But if you've watched some of the prototypes I've seen, you get real-time communication between the vehicle and some other public source of information, and then that requires something.
Your colleague, Professor Christensen, argues about innovators' dilemma, and how companies basically get stuck in it. You were saying that specialists are needed to kind of resolve that dilemma.
Can help resolve that dilemma, yes.
How do you see companies or leading businesses, such as Google, avoid that dilemma, whether having specialists on that side?
I was ready for this question. I brought a slide. So can I do the history first? If I had to take a history, okay, I have an Al Gore slide too, in case you're curious. Okay, so if I was going to take, I know people at Google might resist being compared to Microsoft of 20 years ago, but work with it for a minute. Microsoft was approximately 20 years old when these events occurred. Not saying Google's not exactly 20 years old, but it's pretty close. There was some very strong personalities at the heart of that firm at the time. I'm not saying that's particularly true here, but there's a very large firm. What was true, what happened to Microsoft in this situation, the details are well known. Gates had lots of personal authority, and he had misunderstood the potential for the internet, and there was a skunkworks inside of the company that had done a lot of advanced work. And then I put a picture of Ben Slivka up here because he's actually the guy who wrote the memo that grabbed Gates' attention. And they grabbed his attention late, so that's a historical fact. He came to understand what was about to happen later than many other in industry. If you look at that example and step back from it and say, what's the lesson, which is the essence of your question, I would sort of be both empathetic and critical at the same time. If you look at Microsoft at the time, they were very good at what you would think of as a big push. Deploying products that took several thousand people, organized over multiple years towards a very big goal. They were extraordinarily good at that. And specialists actually can't do that very well, typically. So it was a valuable thing for them to do. The best example we have at the time was Windows 95. Actually fits this. What were they very poor at doing? And I would guess the same would be true here as well. There's sort of two things they were not very good at doing. And it's just inherently true, every large firm is poor at doing this. They weren't very good at planning. They were extraordinarily good at planning relative to their rivals, but they still weren't very good at seeing the future because everybody's poor at doing that. And second, they resisted cannibalizing their own product lines. And lots of reasons why. We could go into those reasons, but lots of reasons why. And it led them, in the direction that you're hinting, to resist understanding businesses that were inconsistent with their present business. That was the actual thing that happened here. If you look at the mistake Gates made at the time, it was he didn't want to cannibalize Windows 95. And he understood its value in a very particular way and resisted another understanding that was inconsistent with that. And the result of that was it slowed them down a tremendous amount, and even for a long time after Gates changed the direction, he resisted. He actually did resist investments to take advantage of what the commercial internet would have allowed his firm to do, because he just resisted cannibalizing his own investments. That I think is the big danger. It's a big danger in a firm like this. There's just natural reasons why existing firms hang on to existing product markets, existing revenue sources. And existing perceptions about where the source of value comes from. That's the issue. And then the hard part is getting the timing right. I mean, Gates was late. That was a preventable error in his case. I think in practice, actually, you want to be more forgiving. It's actually very hard to get timing right in general. Yeah. But that's a lesson of this case. You want the Al Gore slide? Okay, sure. Here, I'll give the one. Everybody always asks. Nobody's asked yet, so I was. But I'm always prepared for this because everyone always asks. What did Al Gore invent, and when did he invent it? The book, I felt an obligation to figure out what actually happened here. So this is the actual quote that started it all. This is a Wolf Blitzer interview in 1999. You can read it as well as I can, but it's I will be offering my vision when my campaign begins, and it will be comprehensive and sweeping, and I hope that it will be compelling enough to draw people toward it. I feel that it will be, but it will emerge from my dialogue with the American people. I've traveled to every part of this country during the last 6 years. During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet. I took the initiative in moving forward a whole range of initiatives, and blah, et cetera, et cetera. That's what did it. So after that interview, the next day, there was a bunch of opposition research, most famous of which came from Trent Lott. If Al Gore invented the internet, I invented the paperclip. Dan Quayle, it was my favorite quote from here. If Al Gore invented the internet, then I invented the spell checker. and there was that's how the meme started. And then this meme, it got started on late night television, top 10 things Al Gore invented, and it just gained its own momentum. And the ridicule is quite funny because it's obvious no one individual could have invented the internet, nor could one policymaker orchestrate the entire thing. That's sort of inherently ridiculous. And that's why it was funny. It was also made for good political campaign, opposition campaign, but that's its source. And the interesting thing, actually watching this in retrospect, I try to explain this to your kids, right? To someone who wasn't there. How did this survive for so long as a meme? And that's the part that's actually hard to explain. And it was just very good politics. And this politician lost control of the conversation. That's where it comes from. It's a great joke, though. Yeah.
But he did sort of push through legislation that
Yes.
directly.
Yeah. So his actual legislative history, if you want that, his actual legislative history is two things. It's two pieces of legislation. It's primarily, though, with funding the National Science Foundation network, particularly the latter bill that upgraded the backbone for the internet and funded supercomputer centers, which were attached to it. And then one of those supercomputer centers was the source of Mosaic, the browser that generated the prototype browser that was the catalyst for the commercial browser. And that backbone was the backbone that was privatized that generated the other movement towards commercial internet. So yeah, he deserves credit for that. That's a real thing. Yeah. How's that? Cool? Well, thank you very much. Thank you.